Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the Qatar America Institute for Culture, I'd like to welcome you to our Expressions, Arts, and Culture Talk. As a nonprofit institution based in Washington, D.C., CAIC is engaged in developing and further enriching the art and culture programming connecting the US, the Qatar, and the larger Arab and Islamic worlds, both online and in person here in the heart of Washington, D.C. Our Expressions, Arts, and Culture Talks are recurring public creative dialogue that features a variety of personalities, artists, and creatives who have lived or worked in the Middle East and whose works were inspired and influenced by these cultures and people. In collaboration with DFI, we have hosted several filmmakers over this year sharing their industry insights and cinema trends within the Middle East. For today's Expression Talks, we thought we'd like to have a little fun since it's so close to Halloween and have a discussion focused on the horror genre. We are thrilled to welcome award-winning filmmaker Babak Anvari, who has previously worked in Qatar and with DFI. From a young age, he has produced short films and video art pieces before moving on to feature films. His debut feature film, Under the Shadow, was screened at several international film festivals and won numerous accolades. Today, we speak with him about his film projects and about his interest and observation on the horror genre. Welcome, Babak.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for making time to be here. So just to kind of get started on the whole topic of, horror, the horror genre, if you can tell us a little bit about your childhood and if there were any particular films or filmmakers from your youth that sparked your interest in filmmaking.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was born in Iran and I grew up there until my late teens, until I was like 18, 19. And then I moved to the UK and I've been living in the UK ever since. So I always say all of my childhood and teenage years have been in Iran and the Middle East, and all of my adult life has been in the UK. And in terms of filmmakers that influenced me, I mean, in all honesty, I kind of felt like I wanted to become a filmmaker at a very young age when I was like 10, 11. And it was watching Hollywood films like Spielberg and Steven Spielberg and Tim Burton films. They really influenced me at a very young age. And then it was only later, when I in my teens that I started having my other sort of idols like, Sidney Lumet, Stanley Kubrick, and like filmmakers from my own country, like Abbas Kiarostami and Asghar Farhadi. They all started influencing me. But I always say, if I boil it down, it was the child in me at the age 10, 11 watching Indiana Jones and Batman Returns and Beetlejuice that inspired me to become a filmmaker.
And were there like any particular horror films did you watch growing up from a specific time period or a specific country? If you could just like whether it's Western but versus Middle Eastern.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, at least where I was growing up in Iran, the horror genre, even to this day, hasn't been really popular. And I somebody needs to do a study on that, like why. So I was like very exposed to more like Western sort of Hollywood horror films, and I used to gobble them up. And bear in mind, I'm a massive wimp. I still am, and I was as a child. So it used to really scare me watching those films. It was kind of like a form of like as if like I was like masochistic. Like I used to watch them, but then not being able to sleep at night. And my parents used to ban me from watching them. But, like some of the horror films that really influenced me are like Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist anything supernatural, The Exorcist, The Omen, all of that really heavily influenced me as I was growing up. There's great classics like Jack Clayton's, great British director, Jack Clayton's Innocence, Nick Rogue's Don't Look Now. All of those like had a massive influence on me.
And you said earlier about how, like, you know, your parents didn't really let you watch horror movies, you know, because there's that fear factor. So what is it about horror movies that appeals to you? Or do you think why people really want to watch horror movies? What is that factor?
I think it's catharsis, to be honest with you. And I think one side of it is going on that roller coaster ride and like want the thrills and the adrenaline rush and like you know, being exposed to the unknown. The other side of it, which I find fascinating, is that I think horror, like sci-fi, sadly there's a bit of a snobbery around it. Like, you know, people think it's pulpy, it's not, you know, you can't take it seriously, which I do not agree with that statement. Especially recently we've seen you know, the emergence of like so many great horror filmmakers and horror films. But what I love about the genre is like almost like sci-fi. You can use the language of metaphor and allegory to tackle some really serious subjects and not being ashamed of tackling them. You know, but like cover it and like, you know, nested in this like sort of entertaining, thrilling stories, and, you know, again, like using your metaphors, and that always appeals to me. And just like sci-fi, like I said, like how there's a bit of a snobbery around the horror genre now, like that was the case with sci-fi back in the 50s. People didn't used to take it seriously as a genre until it changed. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic genre. You can do a lot with it in terms of storytelling.
These are all excellent points that you make, but like Middle Eastern cinema, horror films are usually underrepresented. And like growing up in the Middle East, most of my life, like personally, I grew up in Qatar as well. And there wasn't a lot of Middle Eastern movies that were of a horror genre. So why do you think there is this misrepresentation, particularly in the Middle East?
I think part of it might be because, like I said, the whole world still doesn't take the horror genre too seriously. They think that it cannot tackle some serious subjects, and Middle Eastern cinema usually been like more sort of successful in that sort of field of like sort of more realistic dramas, like social dramas. So I think that just became the norm, the pigeonhole for the Middle East, if I may say. And that's why maybe the genre is not as popular, because again, like as I was growing up, there weren't many great sort of Middle Eastern horror films. There were like one or two that was made in my country, but they weren't, you know, there weren't anything you know, they didn't really like, they weren't as successful as like films like other filmmakers like Jafar Panahi or Abbas Kiarostami, who make like sort of social realist films from my country. So I guess, yeah, I think it's still a young genre there, and that's the reason I gravitated towards it, because you know, growing up watching a lot of horror films, I was like, I want to make a horror film in the Middle East. Like I had this thirst, this hunger to do that, and I was lucky enough to be able to do it with the support of Doha Film Institute. So yeah.
Yeah, it was really quite refreshing to see, you know, a horror movie that was based in the Middle East, and, you know, it was in the native language. So to go back to your movie Under the Shadow and kind of talking back about the underrepresentation of horror in the Middle East, can you tell us a little bit more about the creative process, like your research and writing? And was this an influence or is it a folklore? Like how did you come about with the story?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, some elements of it are, you know, it's not an autobiographical film, but I was born in Iran, like I said, and I grew up there. So some elements of it, it's basically loosely based on my own experience during that time in the 80s in Tehran, but heavily fictionalized, obviously, because it's a horror film. And then the horror aspects is the mythology, the folklore that is very famous across Middle East, as you know, like the myth of jinn, which, you know, obviously predates Islam, but it's also heavily referenced in the Quran and in post-Islamic culture. So I think I was like, why isn't the world aware of such rich sort of myths from the Middle East? And I was like, and obviously with jinn, every Middle Eastern country has its own interpretation and stories and urban legends and myths. So my focus was pretty well, semi sort of like was coming from like the country that I was born and grew up in, but I did a lot of reading and also remembering all those stories, all those like folk stories that used to really scare me as a child. We had this thing at school in Iran that we used to just sit around and telling each other jinn stories and really scaring each other. And like, so remembering all those stories and like letting them influence me, that was key. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
that's perfect, because I find it actually very interesting how you say like every like a lot of Middle Eastern countries, they have their own versions of, you know, what a jinn is, or
yeah,
stories that come around it. So this also resonates with my childhood, you know, like I'm being around my cousins in circles and telling scary stories, knowing it's going to scare us, but that fear factor is really what appeals to us. So it's interesting how someone from Iran, you know, is also going through the same experiences and having, you know, you as an adult trying to remake that, you know, and I see a lot of the scary stories from my childhood are actually from folklores that have been passed down. And I personally believe that's what makes it more different than, say, Western movies, because these are more rooted in our own childhood. So
I totally agree.
yeah.
And that's the thing. That was one of the main things about Under the Shadow. It's just remembering those fears and those scares, the urban legends and the myths I used to hear about jinn. And it's so fascinating because obviously in the West, there's so many occasions that like after watching the film, Western audience came to me and they were like, so what is jinn? Like, is it like genie in the bottle, like in Aladdin? And I was like, well, that's a form of jinn, but like, but yeah, but it's basically like, and it was like fascinating to me because to me, I felt like, well, everyone know what a jinn is. Like, it's like, you know, like we all know what a ghost is, but no, that wasn't the case. Like there's so many times I had to explain to people about the myth, but the interesting point is that it's also a universal idea. It's like a supernatural entity. Like all cultures across the world have their own version of it. So, but then again, there was a universality of it that people, it did not alienate the Western audience who weren't really that familiar with the myth of jinn. They immediately got it. That it's like some sort of like you know,
entity out there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. So like, right, like being a filmmaker who produces horror movies, can you tell us how that is different from, you know, crafting another type of genre of story, if horror is different from that?
I think the key thing is that, which you perfectly touched on, is because it grounded in a more personal place. Like it came from, you know, rather than being any generic story, I was like, what can I bring to the genre that will make it unique? And that was basically looking at my own background and where I'm from. And so that definitely, that was, because look, I always say to people, if you think about it, Under the Shadow is almost like a Gothic haunted house story, but instead of being in Victorian England, it's in 80s Tehran. But you know, it's a haunted house story, and if you break it down. But then I was like, well, how can I make it more unique? And I was like, obviously by looking back or looking within myself and looking at my own culture and my own background, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And it's beautiful in its own way because you're trying to make something scary, but also very personal to you. So exactly. Yeah, I guess that's the beauty of filmmaking. So in 2019, you released another psychological horror film called Wounds, and it was inspired by Nathan, his novella, Nathan Bowen. Yes. So comparing Under the Shadows and Wounds, they were both filmed in different locations with different languages. Does your process change based on having those like different audiences?
Not really. I mean, to be fair, first and foremost for me is the story need to have like some sort of like personal hook or personal connection, and like, you know, there needs to be themes in it that like I want to like sort of dissect and explore. And it was the case with Wounds as well, like which is the story of like a lost soul, the way I put it. You know, trying to find its place in this world, but it's just in a different setting. I think for me, it's always key to find stuff that excites me as a storyteller. And I, you know, my motto is that like, I want to always tell stories and make films that if I were the audience, I would be really eager to watch them and like get excited watching them. But my process hasn't really changed. It's just about finding the right stories that I can tell in my own way. And as I said to you before, like, you know, big part of me is Middle Eastern. I was born and grew up there, but then all of my adult life has been in the West, in the UK. So it's just like the marriage between those worlds and cultures, like, you know, that's something that I'm also constantly think about, like how to sort of analyze that in my films and stories, you know.
Yeah, and did you have the chance to play with new or different like horror tropes?
That's a very good question. I mean, in every film, as pretentious as it sounds, like I am trying my best to play with certain new horror tropes. But I guess new. I would say like you always like try to evolve something as a storyteller, because there's certain tropes that are like so familiar around the world, and then you want to take them and then make them their own and then change them. Like, again, going back to Under the Shadow, obviously it's, like I said, it's a haunted house story, but I was like, well, how can I tell a refreshing, new, unique haunted house story? And I was like, well, I'll take it and put it in my, you know, the country that I was born in the city that I was born in back in the 80s. So I think it's just about like trying to find new ways to tell the same stories or pushing the boundaries, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. And what can we anticipate in terms of your future works, more horror films, if you have any current upcoming projects that you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, I am currently I'm literally editing my next film, this is for Netflix, and I'm in the office next to my cutting room doing this. So I'm in the middle of editing my next film, which hopefully will come out next year. And this one is more like a sort of Hitchcockian thriller set in London. I love horror as a genre, but I love to show a bit of variety, and I love all genres. So I like to like play with all of them if I can. But you know, I've met 2 horror films, and this third one is a thriller. So who knows what's going to be next after this one? I definitely love to do a sci-fi and like obviously drama. You know, I mean, drama is such a broad term, because all stories need to have some sort of dramatic bones. So yeah, gonna try them all. The exception of rom-coms. I don't know if I can do that.
Can you tell us more about the Hitchcock influence?
Hitchcock influence. Wow. I mean, as a filmmaker who's into creating suspense and thriller, I mean, he's the master. Obviously, since I was a child, I used to like devour his films, and you know, like his films like Rear Window or like Vertigo, even Birds, all have been like. He was a genius. He was just so ahead of his time. A psycho, like, and to this day, people still look up at him as like a master. But he also very prolific. He made so many films. Not all of them were great, but he made some amazing ones. So you know, you can forgive the ones that were like a bit like me. So yeah, definitely. I mean, this film that I'm working on currently, it's massively influenced by Hitchcock. So yeah.
And as a Middle Eastern creative, do you find that there's expectations or assumptions about the type of art that you're expected to create?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't know how honest, but you do feel sometimes. Uh, I think at the end of the day, we're all human beings and we want to tell good stories. But you know, sometimes it's a bit of like a double-edged sword because sometimes you feel like you need to push really hard to tell a story like from a Middle Eastern point of view, from a Middle Eastern background. The world is changing. People are opening up and want to sort of know more about different culture. I mean, like perfect example is even though it's not Middle Eastern, it's South Korean, but like just the success of Squid Game, like it's just people are opening up to, you know, like subtitle films or like people like storytellers from different cultures. But sometimes you feel like it's like you really need to push hard to be able to tell those stories. But again, like with like places like Doha Film Institute, who really supports and champions like filmmakers and young and storytellers, that you know, it's becoming more and more possible to do that. But then sometimes also unfairly, you just feel like people only expect you to tell, because you're from a certain background, only to focus on Middle East. And I was like, well, no, like, you know, the world is our oyster. We want to, you know, tell different stories. So, so yeah, I mean, again, I don't know if I answered your question, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I actually wanted to touch on that because I don't know if you remember the Oscars when Parasite won, the director was like, there's basically along the lines that there's so much more out there if we just get over that boundary of subtitles, you know, and that linguistic barrier. So yeah, just kind of.
I totally agree. And in terms of even like diversity, I'm not only talking about film being made in the Middle East, but films that are being outside of Middle East, like pushing for that diversity. Like, you know, it's such an old school way of thinking that like, oh, the audience only wants certain type to be their heroes or play these roles. I was like, that's not true. Like, you know, and that's something I would love to always try my best to push for.
In your own words, do you think that these films are really pushing boundaries, or they're just expanding on, you know, their own personal stories and reaching more people?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, obviously, sometimes, like in the case of Parasite, that won Oscar a few years back. I think both in the terms of storytelling, it was really refreshing, but at the same time, it's just again using the personal to touch on stories and subject matters and themes that are universal. I think that's really key. But then I think the world is becoming in some ways smaller, and people are opening up to different cultures and different stories from different places from the world. That like it's becoming more and more. Yeah, it's becoming easier to sort of like like there's a wealth of like. You know, like for instance, yeah, like like you know, you don't need to always just tell stories through the like the Western lens. You can use the storytelling or metaphors and myths from your own culture. You can borrow from them and let them influence you, but then still be able to tell universal stories, if that makes sense. So it's a bit of both, really.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Babak. That was very informative. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you to our viewers. That brings us to the end of our time today. And Babak, on behalf of everyone at Cake and our audience, I extend a warm thank you to you for joining us and for sharing your global experiences in filming and your insights in horror. And to everyone watching, we hope you have a very fun Halloween, a safe Halloween. Turn into Cake for our social media event updates, including our 2021 Impart special. Thank you, everyone, and take care. Thank you.
Take care. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.